Hello and welcome to today's webinar on using Quebec's notarial records in your family history research. My name is Ginevra Morse, Director of Education and Online Programs here at the New England Historic Genealogical Society. I will be moderating today's event. NEHGS is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history and are pleased to offer this webinar today for our members and friends around the world. So giving today's presentation is Senior Researcher Sheilagh Doerfler. She received her BA in History and Communication from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She assists clients with a variety of research projects, especially those pertaining to Canada. She also has genealogical expertise in New England, Norway, Sweden, Ireland, and adoptions. So in the next 45 minutes or thereabouts, Sheilagh will go over exactly what are notarial records, some basic terminology, how they are created, and why they can be important resources for family historians. She'll also explain how to locate and access those notarial records, and finally provide you with a few case studies. At any time during the presentation, please feel free to write a question in the panel to the right of your screen. Sheilagh will answer as many as she can in the last 10 to 15 minutes of the hour. And we will select questions that are more general in nature, so please consider that when submitting your query. There is no handout for this lecture, but this event is being recorded and you can easily go back and review the video. So don't worry if you miss something on the first listen. You can always go back and rewatch, pause, fast forward, rewind, and that URL for where we'll post the recording is there on the screen, but I will also include it to you in my email following today's presentation. All right, so without further ado, I will turn things over to Sheilagh.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. Today, we're going to be learning about notarial records in Quebec, what they are, why they're important, and how we can locate our ancestors in these records. So what are notarial records? Well, in a nutshell, a notarial record is a legally binding agreement written and recorded by a notary. So in Quebec, notarial records include many different types of records. So this spans from wills to land deeds, to marriage contracts, labor contracts, and estate inventories. And during their lifetime, most residents of Quebec interacted with a notary. So this also includes English, Irish, and Scottish settlers too. Notaries served an important role in your ancestors' community, and they were present at some of the most important times in your ancestors' life. So why are these records so important? Notarial records are crucial to your genealogical research because they provide such important data. They can reveal relationships, and they can often serve as a vital record substitute if the parish registers have been lost or they're sporadic where your ancestor's living. It can also help distinguish your ancestor too, particularly if they have a common name. They also provide detailed information about your ancestor's life, including their profession, their movements, and their economic status. So essentially, notarial records can help you create a richer profile of your ancestor, and they're a must to consult if your ancestor lived in Quebec. But these records do pose many challenges. When your ancestor lived in a particular place, there could have been 10 notaries practicing at the same time. So this means that you may have to look at the records of 10 different notaries. This is especially true in Quebec City and Montreal and some of the larger cities in Quebec. The records are also organized chronologically, and though there have been efforts to index and abstract these notarial records into databases, the nature of their organization forces us to browse the indexes and repertoires for our ancestors. And if you're outside of Quebec, it can be somewhat of a challenge to obtain copies of the original records. So though notarial records pose many challenges, the genealogical information that they can provide is unrivaled. So let's take a look at some different types of notarial records. As I said before, there are many different types, but these are just some of the more common records that you'll uncover. One of the most important types of notarial records is the marriage contract, which was generally written just a few days before a marriage. The marriage contract can provide really important data, including the birthplace of the bride and the groom, if either party's parents were living at the time of the marriage, as well as some information pertaining to the bride's dowry. So the marriage contract can provide a lot more detail than just the sacramental marriage record that you'll find in the Joint collection. Notaries also recorded wills and estate inventories too, and as we know, those are essential in genealogical research. And you'll also find some adoption records in notarial records as well. A pretty unique record in Quebec is the living will. These are generally recorded between parent and child, and this is record is much more common in French Canada. The living will dispersed the property of the parent to the child with the condition that the child would provide care for their parent until their death. So I kind of like to think of this as a Social Security. You'll see wills recorded in English Canada and more in the Eastern Townships. That's more of a common record there. The early wills are much more common in French areas. Notarial records also include land deeds and leases too, another vital source in genealogical research. You'll also find indentured records as well, which are labor contracts. So the notarial system in New France is just a carryover from the French notarial system, and even continued after English rule. The earliest records date to about 1626, and to date, there are about 4 to 5 million records that are known to exist. Most of the records are recorded in French, but you will also find many recorded in English, particularly in the areas populated by the English, Irish, and Scottish settlers. So you may be asking, who are notaries? So initially, there are several different classes of notaries. Some early notaries were appointed by the king, while others were appointed by the local seigneuries to serve their tenants. And there are also just regular notary clerks serving different towns and parishes and cities. So the initial qualifications to become a notary were very simple. You had to be, of course, male, literate, and at least 25 years of age and possess a good moral character. Many notaries learned from their mentors, so you'll see a lot of similarities between different notarial acts and the structure in which they were written, because there's no real guide early on. So it was essentially sort of like an apprenticeship program. So now let's take a look at the recording process. So when you wish to record a marriage contract or a deed or a will or a lease, you would visit your local notary. The notary would then write and record the document, and they would assign a number to the document, and then they would give you a copy of the document. They would then create a copy for themselves, and this was called their minutes. So, and from these minutes, the notary was required by law to create a name index and a chronological repertoire. So these two sources sort of work in conjunction with one another, and they help the user navigate the records of the notary in an efficient way. So later in the presentation, we'll be taking a closer look at, for an example of a name index as well as a repertoire. And then when a notary retired, his records and indexes and repertoires were sent to the local judicial district where they were archived. So this is unique to Quebec, is that notarial records are recorded by judicial district. They're not recorded by town or by county, but by judicial district. So originally there were only 3 judicial districts, Quebec, Montreal, and Trois-Rivières. And as the population in Quebec grew, more districts were added to serve all the different populations. And today there are 36 judicial districts. And we'll go over some examples of this later, but we use finding aids to determine the notaries that serve the judicial district where your ancestor was living. And this is a really handy site that I use all the time. It's part of the Quebec Judicial Government site. And it's essentially the best way that I've uncovered to finding the judicial district of your ancestor. So essentially you type in where your ancestor lived, whether it be Argenteuil or Pont Rouge or something like that, any town, parish, you type it in, and then it'll tell you what judicial district that town is a part of. And so this is essential to understand because we're going to be looking for notaries that served a particular judicial district where our ancestor lived. So this is really key information to know. So make sure you do your homework. Before you even consider using notarial records in your research, It's really key to have established a really clear picture of your ancestor and their family. So due to the way that notarial records are recorded, the key here is to determine both when and where your ancestor may have lived in a town or a parish. You have to have that in the back of your mind, when and where. So our goal is to determine which notaries were serving our ancestors' judicial district when they lived there in a particular time. So it's really, really important to understand the timeline of your ancestor's life. So this is the big question you might be asking yourself. What notary did my ancestor use? So whenever I'm using notarial records, these are the 3 steps that I always follow. 1, establish the residence of your ancestor. 2, determine the judicial district, and then examine finding aids to determine the notaries serving that judicial district. So establish residence. Like I said, it's really important to understand where your ancestor was living and when they were living there. Whenever I'm doing any type of genealogical research, I always create a timeline. And it's really important in notarial records because you want to understand where your ancestor was living at some of their major life events. So birth, marriage, and death. 2, determine the judicial district. So once you have established where your ancestor lived, we type in that parish or that town, and we determine the judicial district. Now 3, one of the more important steps is identifying the notaries. So guides are really crucial to understanding which notaries your ancestor may have utilized during their lifetime. A careful examination of these guides is really key to make sure you're examining the records for all the applicable notaries. Because if you just miss one notary, you may be missing all the records of your ancestor. So whenever I'm using these finding aids, I always consult more than one to make sure I'm doing an exhaustive search. So this is an example of one of the best notarial finding aids out there by Jean-Marie Liberté. It is in French, but it's honestly one of the best guides I've come across. We have it available here at NEHGS. So this guide does a really fantastic job of identifying if a notary was based in a particular town within a judicial district. So this really helps narrow down your list of applicable notaries. So whenever you're looking at these guides, I always suggest that first try to find if a notary was tied to a particular town, and then broaden your search to the entire judicial district. So let's take a look at this finding aid here. So the first column on the left notes the district and the town. So in this guide, the judicial districts are coded. So here we can see all of these communities are part of District 31. So using the codes in the back, that's the Saint Francois Judicial District. So if you look here, Ascot is a town in the eastern townships of Quebec. It's a part of the Saint Francois Judicial District. And if we follow the line to the right, we can see that Charles Gavreau served Ascot between 1815 and 1839. So this is important because if I have an ancestor who's living in Ascot between 1815 and 1839, this is going to be the first notary whose records I'm going to look at because it just makes sense. Our ancestors are going to be using the notary who lived in their town because it's the most convenient. This guide also provides a list of notaries by judicial district too. So if for some reason you can't find a notary that's serving just your ancestor's town, we broaden our search by the next degree, which is to compile a list of the notaries serving that entire district. So these notarial finding aids, they make every effort to identify the appropriate judicial district. When I'm using these, I generally don't concern myself with parent judicial districts. So sort of like if we think about the county system in the US, we always want to think about the parent county to understand if probate records or land records are going to be recorded in a different way. These finding aids make every effort to identify the appropriate modern judicial district. But again, if you're having a hard time finding records for your ancestor, La Liberté, the author of this guide, breaks down the progression of the districts. So you may want to consider examining the records for the older judicial district too. This is another great finding aid that we also have here at NEHCS. It's in English. It's by Robert J. Quinton. I love using this guide because it breaks down the notaries in 3 different ways: alphabetically, chronologically, and by judicial district. And Quinton also makes every effort to tie a notary to a particular town or parish to help you. So where are the notarial records? The bulk of them are going to be at the Bibliothèque et Archives Nationales du Québec, which I will be calling BANC from here on in. It's the depository for the original acts. So in Montreal at the BANC, you'll find the acts, the repertoires, and the indexes for about 2,000 notaries. They've also begun a digitization process, so you can access a lot of those records at that address there. And they have a copy service. So you can email the folks there at the archives, and for a pretty nominal fee, I think it's about a few dollars per act, you can order a copy of the record. And here is a screenshot of the notary page at BANC. On the left-hand side, you'll see that they have the notaries organized by surname and then by district. So you can pop these open and search for a particular notary, or then a list of notaries serving that particular district. Not everything is up there, not everything's complete. For some notaries, they only have the indexes and the repertoires. So if you do find a reference to your ancestor there, you can email the archives and they will provide you a copy. I would also highly recommend coming here to NEHCS. We have an extensive collection of notarial records, and we also have many indexes on microfiche, which is a pretty unrivaled collection in my opinion. We also have several finding aids for notarial records. Again, if you come here, we also have many French-Canadian genealogical handbooks and manuals that can help you too. But most importantly, we have institutional access to the Parchment database. Now, Parchment is an ongoing collaborative project that works to index and abstract all notarial records until 1885. So it's essentially a database where you can search for your ancestor. To date, they've completed until 1800. So if you have early French Canadian or English or Irish or Scottish ancestors who are in Quebec before 1800, I highly recommend coming to the library and using the Parchment database because it's going to save you a lot of time. So here's just a screenshot of what Parchment looks like in the Search Our Database dialog box there. You can type in the name of your ancestor and then adjust the search parameters there. And it'll give you a list of suggested notarial records, and they're essentially little abstracts. So you can download each abstract, and what will be on there will be the act itself, an abstract of the act, whether it be a deed or a marriage contract, the notary recording it, and the date. So this is all of the information that you'll need to then pursue the original record itself. The Family History Library in Salt Lake City has a rather large collection of notarial records, so if you're able to make it out to Salt Lake City, it's definitely worth a trip. They have also worked to digitize a collection of notarial records. They're browsable and they're organized by judicial district. Ancestry has also created a notarial records database too. Their collection is searchable, so that's just like Parchment. You can search for your ancestor there. And over to the right on this database, they also have a browsable set of records too, so you can take a look at the originals. There are also many published collections of records of particular notaries. Some are just limited to a particular notary, and you can also find abstracts of marriage contracts as well. I would suggest searching worldcat.org for the name of the notary or the region that you're researching, and you may find a published collection. And if you're able to make it up to Quebec, the local judicial district and many local repositories also have the original notarial records. So now that we know everything about notarial records, how do we use them? So what we first do is After you've identified the applicable notary and you've determined where the records are held, our next task is to examine the index or the repertoire of the notary. So as I've said, not all notaries have indexes and repertoires that have survived over the years, so sometimes you have to just browse the records themselves. Okay, so let's take a peek at a name index. So this is the 1868 H index of Notary Jean Azury Archambault. So here we can see a protest record recorded for Reuben Hart on the 3rd of January, 1868. So the record was assigned the number 350. Notarial records are recorded chronologically, so it's really vital to note the number that it was assigned because they're going to be recorded in order from 1 to 10,000. That's how they're going to be recorded. So each notary's indexes are different. There's no one standard, but most of them break down by year. So if you have an idea, say you're looking for the marriage contract of your ancestor and they got married in 1830, you can just skip ahead to the 1830 section and then browse for your ancestor's surname. And here's an example of a repertoire. This is the repertoire of Jean Azury Archambault, and it shows the abstract of the same record for Reuben Hart. So here we get a little bit more detail here. We learned that the parties involved were Reuben Hart, John Wood, and John Woodward. So here we can see the same number, 350 off to the left here, and that it's recorded on 3 January 1868. So essentially, the index and the repertoire are just two different ways of looking at the notarial records. So one by surname and then one chronologically. So now that we have all of that important information about this particular act, we can go in and pull it. So the bank had Jean Azury Archambault's notarial acts ready for me. And so I just simply browsed until I located Act 350. So we can see that at the top there on the left. And then also the date, 3 January 1868. And it's a protest of a promissory note. So all of this information here directly corresponds to the index and the repertoire. Okay, let's jump right into our first case study here, locating and accessing a marriage contract. So my task here is to locate the marriage contract of David Champagne and Marie Provencher Villebrun of Nicolet. So as I said before, you always want to know more about the people that you are researching. You can't just jump right in. So I want to learn more about these two families. So I located both of their baptismal records in Drouin, and I learned that both David and Marie are from Nicolet. So to me, this suggested a connection to Nicolet, the parish. David was the son of Joseph Champagne and Francois Martel, while Marie was the daughter of Pierre Provencher Villebrun and Aguette Saint-Cyr. So this is all really important information to know because we want to make sure we're following the right people. Many of you at home with French-Canadian ancestry, you have lots of Maries and Josephs in your family. So the more you know about these people, the easier it will be to distinguish them. So next, I want to learn when they're married because their marriage contract is going to be recorded probably a week to a few days before. So a search of the Drouin collection revealed that the couple married on 6 February 1826 at Saint Jean-Baptiste Cathedral in Nicolet. So in the marriage record is some really important information here. It states that both David and Marie, as well as their parents, were all residents of Nicolet at the time of the marriage. So here I have a place. So this suggested that they would probably use a notary that's tied to Nicolet. Conversely, if Marie was from another parish, I would also determine notaries who serviced her parish too, because it brings another place into play. It's entirely possible that a notary from her parish will be drawing up this marriage contract. So again, pay attention to the minute details in these parish records. So next, I need to understand what judicial district do I need to be looking at. So I searched my dialog box here, and Nicolet is a part of the Trois-Rivières Judicial District. So now that I know where and when I'm looking, I'm going to take a look at the finding aids for notaries. So basically, I looked at both Quintin and La Liberté's notarial record finding aids, and I theorized that they're probably going to be married. The record's probably going to be drawn up in February of 1826. So in my search, I discovered that in February of 1826, there's about a dozen notaries practicing in Trois-Rivières. So that's a really long list. So because I know that they're based in Nicolet, I want to take a closer look, and there's 3 notaries that are tied to that particular town practicing in February of 1826. So this shortens my list quite a bit. It's a little less daunting. So I always recommend trying to find a notary who's serving your particular town and then branch out. So I looked first at the repertoire of Luc Michel Cress, which was on Banque, and I browsed to the year 1826. And lo and behold, here we have the marriage contract of David Champagne and Marie Villebrun, which was recorded 2 February 1826. So just a few days before they're getting married. And on the left here, we can see that it's going to be Act number 1948. Again, very important to understand what the number of the act is. So I returned to Banque and I browsed until Act number 1948. And at the top, this is the, we can see 1948 as well as the date. So what I learned about the Champagnes in this marriage contract was that it was drawn up by David Champagne and Marie's father, because at the time Marie's only 17 and she's a minor in the eyes of the law. The contract outlined how the parties would jointly own all the property during their marriage. And then as well, David gives a gift to Marie. But most importantly was information that I did not know about the family. Marie's father had remarried for a second time. So that means by the time that this has been drawn up, Marie's mother, Agathe Saint-Cyr, had died. So the marriage contract is supplementing information that is in the sacramental record. We're learning a lot more about the family here, and we're getting some really important information. So again, if you want a richer depiction of your ancestors, I would highly recommend trying to pursue the marriage contracts, as you can get a lot of great information. And so don't be shy to get some help. If you don't read French, don't be intimidated. There are many guides that can help you translate these records, and it just takes practice. With some practice, you'll be able to get through them a lot easier. La Fortune's guide, which we have here at NEHGS, is a great resource. It helps you decipher handwriting, and then it also helps you translate notarial records. So you'll find a lot of common legalese in some of these notarial records, and La Fortune's guide helps you pick apart and translate these records. Okay, so let's switch gears and move to our second case study here. Before I begin, I want to say thank you to Carol Gardner of Santa Fe for allowing us to use this particular example. Over the years, Carol has been diligently working to piece together the descendants of Clement Drew of New Hampshire. And she recently wrote an article entitled Clark Drew of Maine and Vermont, which appeared in volume 37 of the Maine Genealogist. So she's continuing to trace the descendants forward through New England, Quebec, and New York, some really difficult places to do research in. And what she did uncover is that several of these Drew family groups moved to the eastern townships of Quebec. And in 2016, Carol hired research services to identify and obtain some notarial records for these Drews. So in particular, one of her goals was to determine the children of Alicia Drew and Sarah Clark here. And here we can see these were the theorized children that Carol had put together through all of her hard work. James, Clement, Elizabeth, Asenath, George, and Alicia. And she, using a mountain of sources, she was able to put this family group together, but she didn't have that one smoking gun that proved that these were the children of Alicia and Sarah. So she was hoping that notarial records would be able to confirm these relationships. So there's some complications at play here, particularly because of the lack of vital records in the Eastern Townships. This is a notoriously difficult area to do research in, so notarial records are a crucial source in this region. There's also several family groups here in the Eastern Townships of the Drews, and they use the same name over and over again, Alicia, Clement, James. So it's really hard to distinguish them. So this is what we know about Alicia and Sarah. So Alicia's born about 1769 in New Hampshire, Maine. And by 1791, he's moved up to Lyman, Maine. And in that year, he marries Sarah Clark. So the family's on the move again. They moved to Caldwell's Manor in Quebec in 1795. And then 10 years later, they move east to Barnston. And about a year after, or the same year that they settle in Barnston, Alicia dies. And we know this because Sarah remarries by September 1806 to a gentleman named John Irish. Here's a lay of the land here. So here we see the Eastern Townships. On the left, we see Caldwell's Manor, where they first settled, and jogging to the east here is Barnston. The Eastern Townships are a planned settlement, and you can see that from the rectangle and square shapes of all the townships. And you can also see that they're named many English and Irish names, which beckons to the type of folks that are settling here. So after the American Revolution, there was a massive settlement of this area by many Loyalists, New Englanders, and New Yorkers. And this is a really fluid border between Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, and you'll see people bounce back and forth quite a bit. The border between the countries is not what it is today. So you may see your ancestor kind of crisscrossing the border multiple times. The reason why so many people are going here is because it's really cheap and fertile farmland. So you see a massive push after the American Revolution. And there are really poor vital records here. Your ancestors could go here and have several children, and you'd have zero record of them. So it's really difficult to learn more about the folks in this region of Quebec, and that's why notarial records are so important. So again, we want to review our 3 steps. Establish the residence of your ancestor, then determine the judicial district, and then examine finding aids to learn what notaries are serving the judicial district. Okay, so here we're establishing the residence of Alicia Drew. So they're in Caldwell's Manor by 1795, and then by 1805 they're in Barnston. And we know that Alicia's probably dying in Barnston in 1805 or 1806. Sarah outlives him, and she's enumerated in Clarenceville in 1825, and that's also in the Eastern Townships. So the big year here is 1805 or 1806, because if I want to prove the children of Alicia Drew, my one goal is to see if he has a will. So understanding that he probably is dying in Barnston in that year is crucial, because that's going to be my first target. So now, what judicial district will we be working in? So a quick search, Barnston is in the Saint-François Judicial District. So now I turn to my finding aids, and I want to learn about all the notaries practicing in the Eastern Townships in that time. And so I was in for a real surprise here. What I did learn was Leon Lelaine served all of the Eastern Townships between 1799 and 1815. So that map that we just saw, that was his entire area. And all of his records are recorded in English because he is servicing the folks that are from New England, New York, Irish settlers, Scottish settlers, and English settlers. So I'm working with one notary. So that's a great win for me. So here at NEHGS, we have his name index, which I examined first for the probate record of Alicia Drew in about 1805 or 1806. Unfortunately, I could not find a record for Alicia, but there were many, many records for the Drew family. And I could also see a lot of interactions between the Drew family and some of their allied families. So I was hoping that maybe I could find some information in all of these records. So what we did was we compiled a list of all the Drew transactions and looked at them for any clues. And what I could see was there's really two really important records that stood out. One was a transaction between Clement Drew, Asenath Drew, Isaac Flagg, George Drew, and Alicia Drew, recorded 9 November 1832. And then the second one was a land deed. It was from James Drew to Sarah Clark, and it was recorded the 20th of April, 1833. So understanding when that transaction was recorded, I browsed to it because, as we know, notarial records are going to be in chronological order. And what we have here is a pretty big surprise. George Drew of Caldwell's Manor, Asenath Drew, who's listed as the wife of Isaac Flagg of Caldwell's Manor, Clement Drew of Caldwell's Manor, and Alicia Drew of Enosburg, Vermont, are all listed as the presumptive heirs of Alicia Drew, who was late of Barnston. So this directly corresponded, the property description that they are listing in this transaction directly corresponded to a property that Carol Gardner had recently discovered for Alicia Drew. So we knew we were working with the right family group here. And this notarial record is recorded more than 25 years after the death of Alicia Drew. But it confirms four of his theorized children. So this was a big win. And again, it points to being thorough and that you have to understand and read all of the records for a family, because you really don't know what you're going to find. Next, I wanted to take a closer look at that deed. So we have a deed from James Drew to Sarah Clark, recorded 20 April 1833. So in here, we get the maiden name of Sarah, and this is a pretty common practice in Quebec notarial records, is women being listed by their maiden name. So Sarah is listed as the mother of James Drew and the relict or the widow of both Alicia Drew and John Irish. So here with this deed, again, recorded more than 25 years after Alicia's death, confirms another child, James Drew. And so though we couldn't locate the probate proceedings of Alicia Clark, two of these notarial records, as I said, recorded many years after his death, helped to confirm 5 of the theorized children of this couple. So I think this case study particularly demonstrates the importance of the notarial records, particularly in a region of Quebec with such poor vital records. So because notarial records are such a technical group of records, I'm going to offer you some tips in troubleshooting. So this is just a reminder. Make sure you do your homework. Understand when and where your ancestor is living at the crucial times of their life, birth, marriage, and death. Don't just jump right into these records. You should have examined census records and the Drouin collection to learn more about your family. And again, make sure you're doing an exhaustive search of notaries. Don't just look at one finding aid. I like to bounce back between 2 or 3 to make sure that I have an accounting of all the notaries practicing in a particular judicial district when my ancestor is living there. So start small. See if you can find a notary that's serving the parish or town where your ancestor is living, and then move to the judicial district. And this is something that I learned the hard way. So I always like to have a map open when I'm doing research. So it's really important to understand where your ancestor is living geographically. They could be living on the edge of a judicial district. Unfortunately, I don't have an access to a map of the judicial districts. There is one at the bank, but your ancestor could be living near a small city or town, and it's going to be a lot more convenient for them to just go into the small city or town, and that city could be part of a different judicial district. So again, look at a map, understand where your ancestor is living. In the 19th century, it's hard to get around, so they're going to be going to the closest place that they can get to. Also be aware, Not all notaries have repertoires and indexes. A lot of them haven't survived. So sometimes you're just going to have to browse through the same set of records looking for a record of your ancestor. And this is a big one. Don't assume that your ancestor used the same notary over and over again. So to make sure that you're doing an exhaustive search, you really have to examine all of the records of the applicable notaries. This is the only way to make sure that you're not going to be missing that marriage contract or that will or that living will or that deed for your ancestor. So if you're still having some difficulty, I always like to check out the county histories and the parish histories where my ancestor lived. Sometimes you'll find a reference to a notary in the area. This is a great way to learn more about where your ancestor is living and applicable notaries. So don't forget those two sources. And we have a fantastic French-Canadian genealogical guide on our website written by Rhonda McClure. You can find a lot of different sources here, from church records to vital records, as well as a section on notarial records. So there's a little bit more further reading here. I would highly suggest taking a quick peek.
All right, thank you, Sheilagh, for your presentation. So now let's tackle your questions. If you have anything that you'd like to ask, go ahead and type it in the questions panel, and Sheilagh will answer as many as she can in the time provided. So we've had several questions about marriage contracts. It's actually all the same question, which is how common a practice was it for people to enter into a marriage contract?
That is a fantastic question. It's a very common practice, particularly with the early settlers of Quebec and the filles du roi, or the king's daughters. You will always find a marriage contract for them, generally speaking. But it's a pretty common practice, and it's a great way to neatly and to neatly divide the property if the marriage dissolved. So more often than not, if you can find a sacramental record for your ancestor in Quebec, they probably have a marriage contract. And this practice was also not as popular among the English-speaking settlers, but you will also see marriage contracts amongst the English and the Irish and the Scottish as well.
All right, and a few questions about immigration information within these notarial records. Would any kind of home countries be listed? If so, in what types of notarial records? Was there a notarial record if someone was kind of coming into the country, or is that completely different? So if you maybe could comment on just kind of immigration information found in these records.
That's another great question. Not to my knowledge that you will find sort of like a home parish or a county within these records. Again, that's something that you'll find with a lot of early English settlers. They'll give like a deposition saying when they came to the country and where they were coming from. That seems to be much more common in the Durand collection, particularly amongst Irish settlers. So a lot of times they will give their home county in marriage records. So I find much more useful information in the Durand collection, so in the sacramental parish registers, than in the notarial records. Again, not to my knowledge. It's entirely possible that there are depositions or things like that, but it's generally not a common record that you're going to find.
And lots of questions about where else in Canada was this notarial record system used? Especially a lot of people are asking about Ontario. Where is this system unique to Quebec? Where else do you find it in Canada?
The system is generally unique to Quebec. La Liberté's guide, the first guide that I talked about, does break down some notaries serving the Ottawa region with the Acadian populations and the 17th and 18th century, notaries did serve those individuals too, and that's going to be in the finding aids as well. I believe that the Parchment database has abstracted some of those notarial records for the Acadian populations in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. But again, check the guides. That's where you're going to find the most pertinent information.
All right. And Peggy asks, how do you determine residence prior to the time of census records? What type of records or resources might help you determine where your ancestor was living?
That is a great question. Pre-census, so pre-1825, I always rely on the Durand collection, which is the birth, marriage, and burial records of French Canada. This will give you a clear picture of where your ancestor was living. And again, I always like to make a timeline. So when they're born, when they're married, and then where the births of their children are taking place, and then where they're being buried. So by following that kind of timeline, you should get a pretty clear picture of where your ancestor is living. So then you can determine the judicial district and then learn about the notaries that are serving that particular area.
Now, Barbara asks, would there be a will or an estate recorded for a woman as well as a man? So maybe if you could talk a little bit about what records, what types of notarial records might exist for women as well.
Great question. Yes, you will find wills or living wills for women, particularly if she's outliving her marriages. So you might find a traditional will or an estate recorded upon death, or you might find a living will. This seems to be much more common with women. So when they're dispersing the property to their child with the condition that you have to take care of me. So that's, like I said before, the living wills are much more common in French Canada. So you will find definitely, it's a very common record, which you will uncover, whereas the traditional will or the estate inventory is much more common in the eastern townships, and I guess in Quebec City and too, with some of the higher populations of English-speaking folks. But again, you will find records of women in these records, and that's why they're so important, because as we know, women are notoriously difficult to follow because they often don't leave a paper trail. You will be able to find records of your ancestors, your female ancestors, in notarial records.
Great. Now, Gary makes the point that the number of judicial districts has gradually increased, you said from 3 to now 36. So how do you determine which judicial district covered a certain town in a certain year?
That's a great question. I rely on the finding aids. They have done the notarial record, the notary finding aids. They have done a great job of identifying the modern district. So pre-1793, there was only the 3 judicial districts, Quebec, Montreal, and Trois-Rivières. And so they were expanded. So a good example of this is the records of Jacques Dufault. He was an early notary in the Terrebonne area. So he was a notary in the 1760s. And what the finding aid has broken out for you is that they have separated them out and they've removed the records from the 3 original judicial districts and identified Terrebonne as where he was serving. So they will account for these modern shifts. I hope I'm explaining this in a way that everyone can understand. Is you really don't have to be concerned with the parent judicial districts. Use what's in the guides because La Liberté and Quinton have done a really fantastic job of breaking that down. Again, if you've done all of our 3 steps and you've compiled a list of all of the notaries, there's always caveats in genealogy. So you can look at La Liberté's guide to learn about the progression of the judicial districts in your area, but it's really not something that you need to be concerned about. If you are looking at notarial records pre-1800, I can't recommend this enough, is to use parchment, because it's going to save you so much time, and it will give you an accurate accounting of where all the records are.
All right, and a few questions about accessing those finding aids. A few people have asked if they are online or if there is an online finding aid that you're aware of. If not, are they only published resources, and where might you be able to find those published sources?
I believe that I think it's called the Chamber of Notaries has a finding aid online, and that's also, it lists current day notaries too. I don't like using that as much. I really like using the finding aids themselves. I don't know if any have been digitized on Google Books or Internet Archive, but again, you can type in the titles to those two books that we shared into WorldCat, and it's entirely possible that they're at a local library, or you can do interlibrary loan. Again, I would rely on those two published sources themselves, and I guess we can make available the Notary Chambers website that I was talking about. So you can search for notaries that way too.
Yeah, I can certainly add or include that link in my follow-up email to you. I'll also include the link to the Judicial District website that Sheilagh's been referring to throughout the presentation, as well as the French-Canadian subject guide, and of course where you're going to be able to find the recording of today's presentation. So maybe just a few more questions before we wrap up for today. A few questions about kind of what were the requirements for people to use notaries. You know, when was it necessary to use one? When was it okay not to? If you could kind of go over that, that would be great.
Sure. So the notary was a part of your everyday life, and you would use them to record any type of transaction. So if you were leasing, so basically, if you think of in terms of the U.S., records that were recorded at the county or the court level. So if it was a deed or a probate, but in notarial records, they really run the gamut. You can find business partnerships, people leasing household furniture, labor contracts, estate inventories, any sort of legal function or document that you would want to have written down, you'd go to a notary. So that's why if you look at any further reading on notaries, you'll find pages and pages and pages of different types of notarial records that you'll find. So it's anything that you'd like to record it in a legal way, sort of get it on paper. That's why when you go visit a notary. And so if your ancestor lived in any part of Quebec, odds are they had something recorded by a notary.
All right, thanks for that clarification. Let's see, there are a few questions about kind of Native Americans in notarial records. Would you, especially since there were so many interactions between, you know, the French and the Native Americans and the English who were living in Quebec, so would there be any kind of reference? Would you see that in a notarial record? Have you come across that?
I haven't come across that in my own research, but it's entirely possible that it does exist in some of the earlier records. There are some itinerant notaries that you'll find in the guides who are servicing a lot of the fur trappers in the western parts of Canada above the Great Lakes. So you might find some interaction between Native peoples and notaries. Again, I would check out parchment because it's from 1626 to 1800 is what they've transcribed. There are also might be some further reading too that we might be able to make available. I can take a peek. I think we might have some early there are some early, we have early Native marriages. We might have something in the library too about references to Native Americans in notarial records. But again, I would try searching parchment, and it's likely going to be in the 17th century, so you'll find the main interaction.
And just to clarify, the parchment database that we have access to through the institutional subscription, you can access that here in the building. It's not, as a member of NEHGS, unfortunately, you aren't able to use it from home. You do have to be here in the building. I would also suggest, asking your local library or genealogical society or historical society. They may already have a subscription to Parchment. If not, by asking them, that shows interest, and so maybe they'll hook you up. But that's something that you can also subscribe to separately. A few questions about adoptions within notarial records. What information is typically included in those?
The information can really run the gamut. Sometimes you'll find the birth parents on there, and sometimes you won't find the birth parents. So pre-1847, most adoption records are going to be recorded by a notary because it's going to be a legal function. Post-1847, it's really, you'll find like private adoptions being mentioned. But again, there's no standard for these notarial records. So it's the way each notary conducts their business and draws up the acts and records their acts is going to be different from the next notary. So it's going to differ from notary to notary.
And Joanne asks, so because of privacy issues, how late into the 20th century can we view notarial records?
I believe that there is a 100-year privacy policy. I don't know if that is spans the entire province or if it's different by judicial district, but I believe it's 100 years.
All right. I know that there are a lot more questions. This is it's a slightly complicated group of records to use. It's something that's unique to Quebec that, we don't typically encounter. So if you do have more questions or if you'd like more hands-on help with your research, do consider scheduling a consultation or hiring our research services team. If you're interested in learning more about either of those services and offerings, feel free to write to the email addresses that you see on your slide. I will also include those in my follow-up email to you later today. So thank you all for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. If you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center, americanancestors.org/education. I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.